Thanks so much. Great pleasure to be here. And I must say that we've just had I think, a absolutely excellent overview of the economic and social consequences of a peculiar, distinctive path chosen by the Ukrainian authorities to develop. In other words, this is not. Speak in the microphone. Thanks. This is not a developmental strategy based on economic rationality, but on political expediency. And I think the perverse consequences are quite outstanding, are quite marked. And such like. What I want to do is something slightly different, building on what Nikolai has just said. What I'm going to focus on is the larger political picture. In other words, I'm going to ask a simple question: how did we get into this mess? How did the European Union, how did Russia, how did Ukraine, how did we all on the European continent, and indeed throughout the Atlantic community, get into this mess? And perhaps then in a discussion you'll give me the answers of how to get out of it, because I'm not sure I know the answers. So what I'm going to make a number of specific points. The first one is that basically that the condition which we've just heard outlined in Ukraine feeds on and intensifies the crisis in the larger European dimension, and vice versa. The fact that for 25 years we've not been able to solve the European peace order, if you like, since the end of the Cold War, since 1989, is feeding into a peculiar form of Ukrainian development. So these two processes, I argue, feed on each other. And it's like a nuclear reaction gone out of control, and it's not quite clear where this is going to end. So, and what are the elements of it? So I'm afraid I use this word monism, but what I'm saying is there is a crisis of Ukrainian state and nation building that quite clearly, on the one side, Ukraine was extremely generous at independence in 1991. It offered citizenship to all those living in Ukraine at that time. And this was a fantastic, unlike, for example, Estonia and Latvia, which excluded certain categories, above all Russian so-called incomers. Ukraine accepted everybody, so it was, we thought, going to achieve a type of civic national development, inclusive, tolerant, and so on. Some of those characteristics continue to this day. I mean, Ukrainian people on the whole, overwhelmingly tolerant, overwhelmingly pluralistic, and inclusive. However, unfortunately, there for 25 years accompanying a major failure to achieve economic development. Ukraine is one of the very few countries, after 25 years of post-communist development, to have a lower GDP than it had in 1991. So well before the crisis of 2013, 2014, there was a catastrophic failure to have a developmental model. The only other country was Kyrgyzstan, and Moldova was just a tiny bit above. So in other words, Poland and Ukraine in 1991 were roughly at per capita level equal in GDP terms. And whereas Poland developed, way ahead, Ukraine remained at the bottom and languished, and in fact, effectively fell. So why has Ukraine, for these 25 years, failed to find not only an economic development model, even a political model? All sorts of reasons. It's one which has got deep roots. But one of the key elements is this fundamental failure to resolve the tension between what I would argue this monist single model and the pluralist model. Now, what is this monist or monadic or singular version? This is the vision of Ukraine as belonging to an ethnic Ukrainian core, that there is a privileged element in Ukraine, and that therefore the Ukrainian language must be the only state language, that all government business to this day takes place only in Ukrainian, that's in the 27 years of independence, for example, not a single PhD in political science, my subject, has been approved in Ukraine in the Russian language, even though Russian language is, widespread and lots of people, and in fact, it's, universal. So, and all official documentation, birth certificates, death certificates, and so on, are purely in Ukrainian, whereas a good large proportion of the population, including above all the older generation, simply don't have that linguistic skill. More than that, this whole basis of this monistic or exclusive model of state building is absolutely predicated on the need to separate from Russia. Russia is seen and interpreted in that framework as an imperial power dominating like an empire over Ukraine as a colony. Now, Ukrainian history is complex, so you could say there's elements of that which, perhaps reflect reality. But this model is ultimately it fails to understand that Ukraine and Russia have developed, as it were, symbiotically over the last 1,000 years. And this is reflected in the second model of Ukrainian state building. This is the pluralistic model. This is the model which says that, yes, Ukraine is made up of many different peoples and lands, even in the west, the parts around Galicia, Lvov, and so on. These came from Poland and other bits before that. They were part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, bits of Ruthenia, a bit of Romania, a bit of Hungary, and so on. And of course, to the south, Crimea was transferred in 1954. Donbass was part of Russia until the early 1920s, when it was transferred by Lenin for economic reasons. And indeed, so in other words, all of Ukraine's borders are contingent and disputed. You may say Ukraine is far from the only one in that condition. That's absolutely the case. However, Ukraine is unique in refusing to give political representation and constitutional form to its diversity. That is absolutely irreducible. The 1996 constitution makes Ukrainian language the single Ukrainian state language, and there was a big debate over the comma, but basically other languages, comma, Russian and others, can be used, but not at the state level. There is the law of 2012, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So basically, it was an exclusive, divisive form of state building against the pluralistic model, which I would argue would have been inclusive, would have taken pride and joy out of Ukrainian diversity, linguistic, territorial, cultural, and so on. Unfortunately, this is not the path taken. Yes, in 2012 there was this minority language law, and some 13 regions, oblasts, have adopted it, which meant that in places where a minority language is used by more than 10% of the people, then it could have a second regional significance. But even that is a highly divisive language law, because, again, it was a type of reverse monism. Because what I would argue is that Ukraine should have done, let us say, something like Wales, for example. Wales was moving towards some sort of civil conflict in the 1950s, late 50s, 60s, and early 70s. But gradually, in Wales, Welsh is now the second, well, often many times the first state language. But a point about in Wales is that everybody living in Wales has to learn Welsh. But obviously English is still the main language of discourse. What Ukraine should have done, this 2012 law, all it did was, in those regions, put Russian effectively. Other places have other languages, but mainly Russian. But again, it suppressed Ukrainian. What I'm saying is that this should have been a country in which both Ukrainian and Russian develop. In other words, that everywhere Ukrainian should have become incumbent for all people living in Ukraine to learn the Ukrainian language. That's normal. That's absolutely not exceptional, but at the same time, Russian is a state language. In other words, both languages and other languages elsewhere to develop, rather than this segmentation, conflict, and so on. Genuine pluralism. That's just one example of the two models of state building. Unfortunately, this monist exclusive revolution or form predominated, and ultimately, that is the deeper meaning of the Maidan revolution. Now, we're all in favour of dignity. The struggle in the Maidan, the central square in Kiev, for struggle against corruption, against the theft and so on. In many ways we could say it was admirable. But unfortunately, the Ukrainian or the Maidan revolution was intensely contradictory. And instead of being emancipatory and liberatory, ultimately it turned out to be a victory of this exclusivist monist force against a pluralistic vision of Ukraine. It was divisive. It basically made at the very center of post-Maidan state building a type of ultra-nationalistic, anti-Russian, in other words, it's in the language of anti-colonialism, anti-imperialism, but it fails to accept or incorporate the really profound lesson of post-colonial studies, is that a colony, a former colony, has the colonial experience has fundamentally changed the nature of that society. Now, India has quite brilliantly managed to incorporate the experience of being a colony. Therefore, English is still one of the major universal language, the railway system and everything, and British law is still at the very core of Indian identity. It's, in other words, it's a hybrid identity emerges after colonialism. That's the very nature of the beast. Instead of which, Ukraine wishes to tear out the very heart of what has made the modern Ukrainian nation, to tear part of it out as a cultural Kulturkampf, a battle against Russian imperialism, which means tearing the very soul of Ukraine out, in other words. And this is the battle at the very heart of the nation going on. And it has taken, since 2014, since the overthrow of Yanukovych on the 22nd of February 2014, it's taken ever more divisive and violent forms. We heard a little bit just now. The Russian films are banned. There's an extraordinary Russian media is banned. Russian journalists are, I think. They've cut flights to Moscow. It's almost, one has to say, almost insane, the level of virulent Russophobia, which is the dominating motif of this government. And what is most astonishing in all of this is that the European endorses this and effectively supports this divisive policy of not, taking joy in your pluralism, but this very violent form of exclusive model of state building. It's extraordinary, and this is one reason why I think that when Dutch people have a choice to vote for this deep and comprehensive free trade or the association agreement, that clearly, how can the European Union be supporting policies in Ukraine which are completely antithetical to the principles on which the European Union claims to be based? Human rights, inclusivity, and so on. Just yesterday, we saw that the LGBT rally in Lvov was beaten up by right-wing gang, and it's not the first time. So this is the paradox of it. European Union is trying to extend a zone of peace and exclusive of development, and it's working with a government which is completely antithetical to the fundamental principles of the European Union. Which then brings us to why I say this crisis is feeding Ukrainian crisis, or that Ukrainian and European crisis feed on each other. What do I mean by that? I've outlined a little bit of the Ukrainian crisis. The other side of it is, and this may annoy some people, but I'm afraid this has been a more and more frightening development over the last few years, is that the European Union ultimately cannot imagine an alternative outside of itself on the European continent. And that is, I'm afraid, a catastrophic failure of imagination. The European Union claims to be the only true representative of the genuine Europe. And of course, this is a monist vision as well. So you have a monist vision in Ukraine, and you have now this monist vision where indeed we could extend it into political philosophy and simply say that liberalism cannot imagine and envisage an alternative outside and beyond itself. So in other words, this is the classic end of history ideology, of course, of 1989, Fukuyama and so on. And Fukuyama was only the representative of this deeper sense of hubristic triumphalism at the end of the Cold War. Now, this hubristic triumphalism has fed into the European Union. Then it has been taken up precisely in a particular form by our East European friends, the Poles, the Lithuanians, and so on, who are obsessed by overcoming Yalta, it's over. Yalta's over. You're in European Union. You're in NATO. What more do you want? Oh, no, we have to use the European Union to amplify historical grievances. Now, these historical grievances are genuine and powerful. I don't for a minute say that they're not. But the whole point of the European Union, in my rather old-fashioned understanding of what it was about, is as a peace project to reconcile France and Germany and the other countries, which it has done most magnificently. The big challenge after 1989 was to ensure that this peace project extended to the East. Above all, the biggest challenge I would ever face the European Union, and that is to bring Russia out from outside and to make it part of this greater European community. Instead of which, we've now come to the point, at which the European Union is amplifying Ukrainian monism, virulent Russophobia, and so on a pan-European level. Reinforced, of course, by the other major development, which is that the European Union, over the last few years, has become ever more deeply embedded in an Atlantic security community. It cannot take decisions about its own security, so they're made in Washington, as simple as that. We have crazies like General Breedlove, who's head of the NATO forces on the European continent, making all sorts of crazier and crazier statements, as we always say. I wonder what they're smoking in NATO headquarters in Brussels, because clearly and I was going to say, I'd like some of that too, please. It's absolutely amazing what he's been getting away with. For example, just last week he was talking about Putin weaponizing the Syrian migrants crisis. I mean, what sort of language is that? First of all, it's totally farcical, as if there wasn't a migrant crisis going on for the last few years as a result of American and Anglo-American geopolitical meddling and blundering in the Middle East, first invading Iraq, Syria, Libya, and so on, as if we aren't responsible. And suddenly Putin is responsible for it. So it's an extraordinary closure of political imagination, which is just reinforcing. No wonder, therefore, Kiev and Brussels find themselves as allies, because both of them have ended up in a very bad place. And that's why, when looking at the larger context of this deep and comprehensive free trade agreement, that ultimately, really, there is only one possibility, that this has to be rejected, and simply to say to the European leaders, guys, you really have to. I mean, don't get me wrong, I want to see strong links between the European Union and Ukraine. I want to see European Union supporting property rights, rule of law, anti-corruption campaigns. All of that would be fantastic. You don't need an association agreement to do that. Just have your programs, have that work, do all of that. Fantastic. And it would be failure of duty even not to do it. So that's not the point. It's that this association agreement endorses that divisive form of state building in Ukraine, which, as I say, is going against exactly. But its most enthusiastic supporters, obviously, are the East Europeans. If you recall, they were the ones who devised the Eastern Partnership from May 2009. Radek Sikorski, the Polish foreign minister, Carl Bildt, two of the most Russophobic politicians in all of Europe, in fact, in all the world. They managed to devise this Eastern Partnership. It was tempered by the Brussels bureaucracy. The language was smoothed down and so on. But they explicitly said Eastern Partnership is a geopolitical play. So when the European Union makes the claim that it is postmodern, that shared sovereignty, all those good things in its own estimation, and yet it's engaging, when it comes to the Eastern European, this Belarus and so on, in classic geopolitical games. And now loads of European commentators, bureaucrats and so on are going up and down the land in UK, giving speeches, geopolitics is back, as if it's suddenly astonished that they've suddenly woken up to the power, as our friend John Laughlin puts it, the power consequences of their own actions. They believed that they were going into some sort of tabula rasa. Ukraine is somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic, as if it had absolutely no historical context, those links which Nikolai so brilliantly outlined just now, as if it was just a vacuum. It's not a vacuum. Ukraine is a country which has for 1,000 years has been intertwined with Russia. Again, I don't think that any country, we're not talking about a restoration of the Yalta system of limited sovereignty, if you like, of Ukraine, that they can't take sovereign choices. The point is that the sovereign choice of Ukraine has to be a pluralistic one. It has to reflect its diversity and its deep economic links. I mean, adding to Nikolai, it's the overwhelming element of its developed manufacturing and industrial sector was oriented to the Russian market. And in the last 2 years, almost all the major enterprises in Ukraine, advanced technology sectors, have died. For example, the Antonov huge transport plane, which was a joint Russian-Ukrainian venture, is dead. The plant is bankrupt. Motor Sich, which was making helicopter engines, which is the major supplier to Russia, is basically kaput. The Nikolaev plant, which was making world-leading motors for ships, the propulsion systems are very complex, very advanced, with massive Russian investment, closed, and the list could go on and on and on. Basically, all that Ukraine is able to sell to the European Union today is sunflower seeds. So from selling advanced technology to the East, it is selling sunflower, because that's the only product, basically, which doesn't compete with Western goods. Who needs vast amounts of Ukrainian meat and so on when we've got a surplus? The French farmers, the Dutch farmers are not going to be too happy to open up the elements to all of this. So in other words, we've got ourselves into a major crisis. I will just say one word about Russia in all of this. There's often the claim that Russia has become a revisionist power, that it's revisionist, that it's overthrown the rule of law and the peace order after the end of the Cold War and so on. First forcible change of territory since the Second World War. They forget Goa in 1961. But what I would say here is that, I mean, I'm against spheres of influence. I agree that there shouldn't be. What we are trying to establish is a cooperative order. And I'm just going to say, to put the context, to explain that I don't think Russia is a revisionist power. In Ukraine, it acted, and the acts were revisionist. It was revisionist acts, but not part of a revisionist strategy. In other words, Russia was not out there to destroy the system of international law. What it was saying is, you've partially, exclusively applied this international law, so therefore Russia is not a revisionist power, it's neo-revisionist. It's condemning not the law and international law itself, but the way they are practiced by the dominant Western hegemony, that is the Atlantic system, and above all, Anglo-American hegemony in that system. So what Russia has tried to do since the end of the Cold War, it wanted to join the Greater West. It believed, and this is Gorbachev in his latest book, Posle Kremlia, which is just coming out in English. Gorbachev, at the celebrations for the end of the fall of the Berlin Wall in 2014, was very explicit. You betrayed us. We believed, that's Mikhail Sergeyevich Gorbachev, during Perestroika, that with the end of the Cold War, we could establish an inclusive, equitable, new European security order in which Russia takes its honored place as a genuine member of this new community. In other words, what I call the Greater West. And this was going to be a West which Russia joins, but by the mere fact of Russia joining it, the West would actually obviously have to change. The United States would have to share its hegemony with another power, but the price, it's a small price to pay for peace. The dismantling of NATO, the dismantling of all that massive expenses. I know in Holland now you've got this big debate over whether to invest in your I wasn't going to say anything nasty, the submarines. Well, of course, all of that would have been, the United States, of course, is pressing on Holland to increase its defense budget to 2% and so on. How can we be talking in these terms 25, 27 years at the end of the Cold War? I mean, this is so absurd. It is so infantile. I'm almost, speechless even in looking at it. That we're still talking in this way. In the United States, are still dominating our security agenda. Ours. This is by ours. I mean our European security agenda. So Russia wanted to join this Greater West. The United States, and as the Chinese said, as I say in the book, there can only be one tiger on the mountain, and so this. I mean, it was robust. And don't forget, so we had 25 years of the Cold Peace. Now, the term Cold Peace didn't come from Putin, it came from Yeltsin, and it was December 1994. Understanding that there was no way Russia could join, and Andrei Kozyrev, the great liberal and so on, could join this Greater West. So instead of having this new, enlarged, and this would have been what I call dialogical. In other words, by dialogue, you change both sides. That, in other words, the West would have changed and Russia would have changed, I believe most positively, in this new greater Western community. Instead of which, what we got was simply the enlargement of the Old West. That's NATO, with its CENTCOM, Eurocom, or with all of its battleships and so on and so forth. And so the Old West simply enlarged. Now, as I said, even the liberals in the 1990s says NATO enlargement. Okay, there were all sorts of sweetening pills and so on, NATO-Russia Council and so on. But as Grigory Yavlinsky said, the head of the liberal Yabloko party, says, okay, you can paint your tank pink. You can stick a flower in its barrel, but there's still a great blundering tank coming up to our borders. However you may try to soften the pill, it's still softening the pill. The pill, you're still forcing us, the pill of humiliation, the pill of exclusion, and so on. So we had this 25 years to impasse. Russia had nowhere to go strategically. Nowhere to go strategically. It wanted, even Putin, when he came to power in 2000, in an interview with David Frost, he was asked by David Frost, can Russia join NATO? And Putin said, "I почему нет?" And why not? So he really wanted to join it. In fact, the big criticism of Putin in Moscow today even is that he's too soft, too keen to join this West, still to this day. And he really is. After him will be, Russia, Putin is temporary, Russia is eternal. And so that's going to go on. So this is the catastrophic strategy. Russia had nowhere to go strategically, because it couldn't join this greater West, so it tries these other things, Eurasian Economic Union and so on. Russia cannot go to the East ultimately. It's sensible to have good relations with China and so on, but ultimately Russia is a European power, and that we need to find a new European security order in which it feels comfortable. Therefore, now the only way forwards is this program of Greater Europe. We can't get a Greater West, okay, Greater Europe. That is European Union, Turkey, Ukraine, and so on, where the idea of choice for these countries is just simply absurd. It's choice of which these cannot make a choice. And this association agreement is forcing a choice where there should be no choice. It should be, as Nikolai says, a partnership for all the countries, including Turkey, in this greater European community. And that really, it behooves us. It is incumbent upon our generation and us now to think of a way to achieve this new inclusive European security and economic order, instead of which the European Union claims to have the unique voice. And I'm afraid that European Union voice is now speaking. I'm afraid it's now endorsing policies which I find repugnant, and it's shameful upon it. In years to come, we who are questioning this will actually then say we've saved the honour of the European Union, because otherwise it's compromising far too much in its geopolitical contestation with Russia. So what I am calling for is let's work for a greater Europe, but within that framework, a greater West, because obviously working with the United States, we're not talking about any best part of the United States, let's put it this way, clearly is part of the solution, and the cheap anti-Americanism isn't going to get us anywhere as the great power force. So anyway, this is the agenda which faces us, not a short-term association agreement with a government which is unstable, divisive, and ultimately, I think, against all the principles on which the European Union should be built. Thank you.